retired at 64 and spent 3 years turning my late wife's dream into something real, a cedar frame cottage on the shores of Georgian Bay, the kind of place Margaret had sketched on napkins for 30 years. Then my daughter-in-law called and told me her brother's family would be moving in for the summer. She didn't ask. She informed me, the way you inform someone of a weather forecast. When I didn't immediately agree, she said if I had a problem with it, I should consider whether I really needed a place that size at my age. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. But I had 8 days before they were supposed to arrive, and I used every single one of them. The cottage had been Margaret's idea from the beginning. We'd driven past a for sale sign on a gravel road off Highway 400 sometime in the late 90s, and she'd made me pull over. Just to look, she said. We stood there in October drizzle, looking at a rundown property with broken dockboards and a roof that clearly needed replacing, and she'd grabbed my arm and said, "This is it, Arthur." I'd laughed. We were raising 2 kids on a teacher's salary and my income from the sheet metal fabrication plant in Barre. We had no business buying a waterfront cottage. But I'd written down the address. I worked at Dominion Metal Fabrication for 31 years. I wasn't management. I ran a quality inspection team, 12 people, and I was good at it. Precise. Patient. Margaret taught grade 4 at Allendale Heights Elementary until her knees got bad. Then she tutored from home. We didn't take extravagant vacations. We drove used Corollas. We packed lunches. We put 2 kids through university without loans, and we paid off the Barry house by the time we were both 53. Margaret was diagnosed in the winter of her 61st year. Pancreatic. The doctor used words like aggressive and timeline and quality of life, and we sat in that office on Dunlop Street and held hands and didn't speak for what felt like a long time. She lived 14 months after the diagnosis, 14 months where she was still herself, sharp, funny, occasionally infuriating, and then 3 weeks where she wasn't. After she was gone, I found a notebook in her nightstand. She'd written a list near the back. Just a list near the back. Just a list, no explanation. At the top, Georgian Bay Cottage. Cedar, west facing. Dot for sunsets. Below that, a list of small things. A porch swing. A wood stove. A kitchen, big enough to cook with other people. Room for grandchildren. I sold the Barry house 18 months after she passed, and I bought the property on Georgian Bay, not the original one we'd looked at. That had long since sold and been developed. But a 3-bedroom cottage on a half-acre lot near Honey Harbour with exactly the west-facing exposure she'd wanted. I spent 2 years fixing it properly. New roof. Repoured foundation on the boathouse. Installed a Blaze King wood stove in the main room. Built a porch swing myself from white ash. I sourced from a mill in Midland. I wasn't doing it for me exactly. I was doing it for her, and also, slowly, for myself. My son Callum had watched all of this with what I'd call cautious approval. He lived in Mississauga with his wife Danielle and their 2 daughters, and they visited the cottage twice the first summer and 3 times the second. Callum would help with projects. He's handy, always has been, and we'd have good weekends there. The kind where nobody looks at their phone much, and the kids catch frogs off the dock. What I noticed was that Danielle was pleasant on those visits, but rarely relaxed. She had a way of surveying rooms with her eyes that reminded me of a property assessor. Danielle had a younger brother, Sean. I'd met him at the wedding and a few times since. He worked in sales of some kind. I never fully understood what he sold. And his wife Krista had the aggressive cheerfulness of someone performing contentment. They had 3 kids under 10. Every time I'd been around them, something had been in crisis. The basement had flooded. The van needed a transmission. The landlord was selling the rental property they'd been in for 4 years. There was always something, and the something always seemed to require other people's resources. It was a Thursday evening in April when Danielle called. Callum was traveling for work. He does something with infrastructure logistics, takes him to Calgary a lot, and I was in the cottage workshop sanding a replacement board for the dock. I'd had the radio on, CBC, and I almost didn't hear my phone over the belt sander. "Dad, I need to let you know about the summer arrangement." That's what she said. "Let you know. Not ask you about or talk to you about. Let you know." She explained that Sean and Krista's landlord had not renewed their lease, and they needed somewhere to stay while they looked for a new rental. The market in Barrie, she said, was insane right now. and it might take 2 or 3 months. The cottage was the obvious solution. 3 bedrooms right there, and I only used it on weekends anyway. It was basically sitting empty, she said. I set down the piece of sandpaper I was holding. Danielle, I said, I live here. She made a small impatient sound. You're not there full-time, Dad. You still go back to Barry during the week sometimes. That's because I have a doctor and a dentist and the storage unit there. This is my home. Look, she said, and her voice shifted into the register. I'd noticed before, patient but firm. The way you speak to someone who is being unreasonable but whom you've decided to humor. Sean's family has nowhere to go. You have a 3-bedroom cottage on Georgian Bay. They have 3 young children. Surely you can see that the right thing here is to help family. Does Callum know about this? Callum and I are on the same page. I want to hear that from him. She paused. He's in Calgary. I know. He has a phone. Dad, I'm asking you not to make this into a thing. These are good people. They're family. This isn't a big request. I looked out the workshop window at the bay. The light was going gold over the water. A pair of mergunsers were working their way along the shoreline. When are they planning to arrive? I asked. We were thinking the long weekend, Victoria Day. That's 8 days from now. Like I said, they need somewhere quickly. I told her I'd think about it, and I ended the call. Then I sat down on my workshop stool and stayed there for about 20 minutes, just breathing, watching the light go off the water. I thought about Margaret's notebook. I thought about the porch swing I'd built. I thought about every Saturday morning I'd eaten a brown bag lunch at my workstation, while the office cleared out for Tim Hortons. Every Christmas bonus I'd put toward the mortgage instead of a vacation. Every hour of work I'd put into this property with my own hands. I thought about the way Danielle had said, letting you know. I'm 64 years old, and I have never in my life been the kind of man who shouts or throws things or storms out of rooms. What I am is thorough. I approach problems the way I approached quality inspection. Document everything, understand the specifications, and don't deviate from the standard because someone is applying social pressure. I went inside and made tea and started making a list. The first call I made Friday morning was to a lawyer in Midland named Patricia Okafor, whose name I'd gotten from a neighbor who'd used her for a boundary dispute the previous fall. I explained the situation plainly, and she listened without interruption. Here's what you need to understand, she said when I'd finished. The moment anyone stays in your property for longer than a short visit in Ontario, you're in landlord-tenant territory. It's not just about your right to refuse entry. If they establish residency, and that threshold is lower than most people think, getting them out becomes a formal legal process. We're talking landlord and tenant board. Months. She paused. You have every right to say no. What if they show up anyway? Then you call the OPP and report an unauthorized entry. But we'd want documentation of every communication leading up to that. Every text, every voicemail, every conversation you remember. I hired her that same day. $2,500 retainer. I have never in my life spent money more willingly. Friday afternoon, I drove to the Canadian Tire in Penetanguishene and bought 2 trail cameras, the kind hunters use for monitoring game paths. Motion-activated, cellular-connected, weatherproof. The man in the sporting goods section helped me pick models with night vision. I also bought a motion-activated floodlight for the driveway. I told him I'd been having trouble with raccoons getting into the boathouse. He recommended the floodlight and I bought it. I spent Saturday installing everything. 1 camera mounted in the cedar by the driveway gate, 1 under the soffit above the front door, the floodlight aimed at the driveway approach. I tested each one from my phone, adjusted angles, checked the cellular signal. 31 years of quality inspection means you don't stop until the coverage is complete and documented. Sunday I called Callum directly. He answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded tired. Dad. Hey. Your wife called me Thursday. She told me you and she were on the same page about her brother staying here this summer. Silence. Then, she told you that? She did. Are you? He stopped. She told me she was going to talk to you. That it would probably be fine. That's not the same thing as being on the same page. More silence. The long kind. I could hear traffic in the background. He was probably in a parking lot somewhere in Calgary. Dad, Sean, and Krista are kind of in a rough spot. They're frequently in a rough spot, Callum. I know. Do you know that she called me and informed me, not asked me, that they'd be arriving at my home in 8 days? That when I pushed back, she told me I should consider whether I really needed a place this size? Another silence. I heard him exhale slowly. She said that? She did. So I want to know, son, was this something you agreed to and asked her to pass along, or is this something she decided and presented to you as settled? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. She said, "You'd probably be fine with it." That it was just a few months. I said I wasn't sure we should assume that without asking you first, and she said she'd handle it. I see. Dad, I didn't. I'm sorry if it came across as... I told him not to apologize yet. I told him I needed him to understand that I was not going to allow his brother-in-law's family to move into this cottage, and that whatever Danielle had communicated to him or to them about my likely response was her version of events, not mine. I kept my voice level. I wanted him to hear the words clearly, not the emotion underneath them, which I was managing. He said he'd talked to Danielle. I told him there was something else he should know. I told him I was going to have my lawyer send a letter documenting my position. I told him I was doing this not to cause problems, but to protect myself and to make sure everyone understood where the legal lines were. He said, "You hired a lawyer?" I said. "She called me and told me strangers were moving into my home, Callum." "Yes, I hired a lawyer. He said he'd call me back." He sounded like a man who had just learned something about his domestic situation that he hadn't known before. Patricia drafted a clear, polite letter to Danielle on Monday. It stated that I, Arthur Hewitt, was the sole registered owner of the property at the address in question, that I had not consented to any occupancy arrangement, that any unauthorized entry would be treated as trespassing under the Ontario Trespass to Property Act, that I was prepared to contact the Ontario Provincial Police if necessary. The tone was not hostile. It was a statement of facts. Danielle called me 20 minutes after she received it. Her voice had a new quality to it, still controlled but with something beneath it, something that wanted to be a shout but was holding itself in check. "You sent me a legal letter," she said. "My lawyer sent you a letter, yes, about your own family, about people I barely know using my home without my permission. This is unbelievable, Dad. Do you understand what you're doing to this family? To Sean and Krista? They have 3 children, and they had months of notice that their lease was ending and chose not to make other arrangements because Sean assumed this would work out." "That's not my problem, Danielle. Callum is going to hear about this. Callum already knows. I spoke to him Sunday. He was in Calgary when you called me, you'll recall." She hung up. Victoria Day weekend came. I was on my porch with a coffee and a Peter Robinson novel when the driveway camera alert appeared on my phone. A silver minivan came up the gravel road and stopped at my gate. I watched the feed. Sean got out first, then Krista. 3 kids piled out behind her. They stood there looking at the property. Sean had his hands on his hips. He said something to Krista I couldn't hear on the feed, but his body language was clear. He'd been expecting to walk in. I came down to meet them at the gate. "Sean, Krista, this is a surprise. Arthur." Sean's jaw was set. "Danielle said you'd been difficult about this." "Danielle mischaracterized the situation. This is my home, and I told your sister I wouldn't be having guests this summer." Krista's arms were crossed. "We have nowhere to go. We have 3 kids. I understand that's genuinely difficult. I'm sorry your housing situation is what it is. But I didn't cause that situation, and I'm not in a position to solve it by handing over my home." Sean took a step forward. "Look, Art, let's be adults here. It's a big place. You're one person. We'd be out of your hair completely by fall. You wouldn't even know we were here." "I'd know," I said. "And my name is Arthur." He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the camera mounted under the soffit. Then he looked at the camera mounted under the soffit. Then he looked back at me. "You're recording this?" "I'm recording my property." "Yes, I have been all week." Krista pulled at his sleeve. "Let's just call Danielle." You can call whoever you like, I told them. But this property doesn't change hands on a phone call. If you enter through that gate without my permission, I'll call the OPP. There's a Best Western in Midland. The Comfort Inn in Penetanguishene is also quite good. I recommend both of them. They went back to the minivan. The kids hadn't made a sound through the whole thing. I watched them reverse down the gravel road and felt nothing in particular. Not triumphant, not guilty. Just clear, the way you feel after you completed a piece of work correctly. Danielle's retaliation started the following week. The first thing was a post in the community Facebook group for the Honey Harbor area. Someone with a fake account created the same day, suggesting that a property owner on my road had been hostile and threatening to a family with young children seeking temporary shelter. The post got some engagement. A few people expressed concern. I screenshotted everything and forwarded it to Patricia. This is defamation, she said. Small and sloppy, but defamation. Document it. 2 days later, I got a call from my grandson's school. Not directly. A message through Callum, which is how I understood it had come from Danielle, not from any real concern. She'd apparently mentioned to someone, who'd mentioned to someone else, that she was worried about my mental state. That the isolation at the cottage was affecting my judgment, that my decisions were becoming erratic. Nothing formal, nothing that came to anything. But I understood the intent. She was salting the earth. I called Callum that evening. He picked up on the first ring. I know, he said, before I could speak. I know what she's been doing. His voice sounded different from how it had on the Calgary call. Flatter, more tired. How long have you known? He was quiet for a moment. I've been doing some thinking since we talked. About a few things. He paused. She transferred $12,000 out of our joint savings account in February. She said it was for her parents' dental and her brother's van. I didn't ask questions. I trusted her. He stopped. I should have asked questions. Callum, there's more. I found an email. She'd been talking to a property management company about the cottage, about rental income. I sat down. She was planning to rent it out. She was asking about what they'd need from the property owner to list it on Airbnb. His voice had gone careful, the way you speak when you're trying not to crack. She told them her father-in-law was elderly and not well, and that she was helping to manage his affairs. I held the phone and said nothing for a moment. How long has this been going on? The email was from January, before any of the conversation about Sean staying there. So this was never about Sean needing a place to live. I don't know, Dad. I don't know how much of it was planned and how much was opportunistic. He exhaled. I think the Sean thing was partly real. They do have a housing problem, but I think Danielle saw it as a way to get a foot in the door. Once her brother's family was in there, established, it's harder to remove people. And then maybe gradually, she becomes the one managing things. Yeah. He said it quietly. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm really sorry. I told him not to apologize to me. Not yet. I told him I needed him to come to the cottage that weekend. Just him. He arrived Saturday afternoon in his Subaru. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks, which, I learned, was accurate. We sat on the porch, and I made tea, and for a while we didn't talk about Danielle or Sean or any of it. I showed him the work I'd done on the dockboards. We walked the property. He helped me split some wood for the stove, even though it was May and I didn't need it yet. There's something clarifying about splitting wood. It doesn't leave room for the noise in your head. After dinner, we sat on the porch in the last of the light, and I told him everything I'd documented. The letter, the cameras, the Facebook post, the property management inquiry. I showed him the screenshots on my laptop. He read through everything carefully, the way his mother used to read things, fully, not skimming. When he finished, he closed the laptop and sat back. She was going to try to monetize your home, he said. Your home that you built for Mum. I didn't say anything. What do you think I should do? I told him the same thing I'd told his mother's memory 100 times since I bought the property. I don't know what you should do. But you deserve to make that decision with the full truth in front of you. He stayed through Sunday. We didn't talk about it again. We watched the May long weekend boaters come past on the bay. We cooked a roast chicken. Monday morning, before he left, he hugged me for a long time in the driveway. I'm going to figure this out, he said. I know you will. Take care of the place, hey? Always, son. I watched him drive away through the cedar trees and went inside to call Patricia with an update. The weeks that followed were quiet, the deceptive kind. Callum moved through what I understood was a difficult period of confrontation and unwinding. He's a methodical person, gets it from both of us, I think, and he doesn't make decisions lightly. What I knew was that he was talking to a lawyer of his own, untangling the financial piece, trying to understand the full picture. Danielle called me once during that period. Her voice was different than it had been before, no longer controlled and managing. She sounded small and, underneath the anger, frightened. "You turned him against me," she said. "I told him the truth," I said. "About things he had a right to know. He would never have questioned me if you hadn't." She started again. "We were a family. You still are, if you choose to be. That's not up to me." She hung up. 3 months later, Callum called to tell me he and Danielle were separating. He'd asked her to leave the Mississauga house while they worked through the legal process. She was staying with her parents in Kitchener. Sean and Krista had found a rental in Innisfail, a townhouse, reasonable rent, third-floor unit. They'd found it 3 weeks after I'd turned them away at the gate, which suggested the housing emergency had been somewhat exaggerated. "How are you doing, really?" I asked him. He was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I keep waiting to feel worse than I do." He paused. "I think I've been managing a lot of anxiety for a long time without understanding. That's what it was. Walking on eggshells. It's like," he searched for the word, "it's like I had a low-grade noise in my life for years, and now it's gone, and I can think properly again." "I know that feeling," I told him. "What do you mean?" "After your mother died," I said, "there was grief. Real grief, enormous grief. But there was also, underneath it, and I felt guilty for noticing this, a kind of quiet, a space. We'd been managing her illness together for over a year, and that management takes a toll you don't notice until it stops." He said nothing, and I continued. "This is different. But the part about being able to think clearly, yes. I know what you mean." He came up to the cottage that weekend and the one after that. By July, he was coming most weekends, sometimes bringing his daughters, who were staying with him 50% of the time while things were sorted out. The girls were 9 and 12. They were quieter than I expected, a little watchful. Then one Saturday, the 12-year-old, Isabel, asked if she could try paddling the canoe, and the afternoon opened up into something easy and unhurried. By the end of the day, she'd gotten the J-stroke mostly right and was coaching her younger sister from the bow with the authority of someone who'd been doing it for years. I stood on the dock, watching them, and felt something shift in my chest. The cottage was doing what it was supposed to do. Callum's separation became final in the spring. He'd moved out of the Mississauga house by then and found a place in Barrie, close enough to his daughter's school, close enough to the 400 to get to the cottage on weekends. He was quieter than he used to be, but it was a different kind of quiet from before, steadier. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, one evening on the dock, not quite looking at me. I waited. "She works at the office park where my company leases space. Her name is Vivienne. She's divorced, has a son 12 years old." He paused. "I'm not in any hurry about anything, but she's a good person, and she makes me feel like I'm not," he searched for the word again, "like I'm not bracing all the time." I looked at him. "Bring her up sometime. You'd be okay with that?" "Callum, this place was built for people I love to gather in." "Yes, bring her up." He brought her up in June, a Saturday. Vivienne was compact and direct, with the kind of laugh that makes other people laugh without knowing why. Her son Thomas had apparently been told about the canoe. He asked to try it within 40 minutes of arriving, which I liked. He and Isabel took it out together while the adults drank coffee on the porch, and within an hour they'd covered most of the bay. That evening, while Callum and Vivienne did the dinner dishes, I sat on the porch swing, the one I'd built from white ash, the one that had been in Margaret's notebook, and listened to the sound of voices coming from inside. Laughter. Something getting knocked over. Then more laughter. I had a bourbon. The bay was going still and dark. A loon called once from somewhere near the far shore. That long, wavering note that sounds like a question you haven't figured out how to ask. I thought about the April evening, when I'd sat in this workshop, with Danielle's phone call still in my ears, watching the gold go off the water. I'd been afraid, in a way I wouldn't have admitted at the time, not of losing the cottage. I'd known, legally, how to protect it, but of what the fight would cost. Of whether protecting this place would damage something with Callum that couldn't be repaired. Of whether I'd end up alone here after all. What I had instead, my son within driving distance, 2 granddaughters who knew how to read the wind on the water, a woman in my kitchen making my son laugh for the first time in years. The promise, maybe, of summer mornings. Not that far off, with children running down to the dock. Margaret would have liked Vivian, I thought. She would have taken exactly 4 minutes to size her up, and then been her fiercest advocate for the rest of her life. I'd bought this place for peace. I'd found something better. The distinction, I decided, was worth the cost. Callum came out to the porch and sat down beside me. The night was cool and clear, the kind of May evening that still carries a trace of winter underneath it, a proper Canadian spring. "You doing okay?" he asked. He asks me that every time he visits. I used to deflect. "I'm good, son," I said. "I'm really good." He nodded, and we sat there for a while, the two of us, listening to the bay settle into dark. The porch swing is where I do most of my real thinking, Mel. White ash, mortise and tenon joints, built from a sketch in my late wife's notebook. It holds the weight of a person without complaint, which is more than I can say for a lot of things. I've had time to sit with what happened, and what I keep coming back to isn't the confrontation at the gate, or the legal letter, or even the property management email. What I keep coming back to is how long I almost let it happen, how close I came to saying nothing, absorbing the imposition the way I'd absorbed so many smaller ones over the years, and calling that patience. It wasn't patience. It was avoidance dressed up to look reasonable. There's something that happens when you don't act on what you know to be right. It doesn't disappear. It compounds. Danielle's plan didn't start the day she called me. It had been building quietly for months, in January emails to property management companies, in transfers from Callum's joint account, in a slow accumulation of small overreaches that had never been meaningfully pushed back on. Each one that went unchallenged made the next one feel more possible. That's how entitlement grows, not in a single demand, but in the long patience of everyone around it. What I did wasn't complicated. I documented. I hired professionals. I held a line that was always mine to hold, and I held it calmly, without anger, without drama, just clarity. 31 years in quality inspection teaches you that the most dangerous problems aren't the loud failures. They're the small deviations that get normalized until the standard disappears entirely. The same principle applies to how people treat each other. The part I didn't anticipate was what it would do for Callum. I wasn't trying to save my son's marriage. I couldn't have, and it wasn't my place to try. What I could do was make sure that when the time came for him to make a hard decision, he had the full truth in front of him, instead of a carefully managed version of it. That's what I gave him. Not a rescue, just honest information and the space to think clearly. What he did with it was his. The courage it took to look at those bank records, to confront what he found, to choose a difficult and honest path over a comfortable and dishonest one that came from him. I just didn't get out of its way. I've watched Callum this past year, and I've seen something settle in him. He carries himself differently. He makes decisions more directly. He laughs more easily. That's not the result of things getting easier. His life has been genuinely hard. The divorce, the finances, rebuilding. It's the result of a person learning to trust their own judgment again. There's no shortcut to that. You arrive at it by making hard calls and living honestly with the consequences, and then doing it again. Margaret would have understood all of this immediately and said so in about 12 words. She had that economy of insight I've spent a lifetime trying to approximate. The bay is quiet tonight. The loons are out somewhere past the point, doing their thing. Callum is inside with Vivienne and the kids, and I can hear laughter through the screen door, the unstudied kind, the kind you don't produce on purpose. That sound is what this place was always supposed to be for. I built this cottage for her, and I've kept it for all of us. That feels right. It feels, finally, like exactly enough.